starting again. We just hit the record button. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about today is class sequencing. A lot of times people refer to that as asanas, asanas, however you want to say it. If you don't know, I have a difficult time saying words, which is another reason why I don't like using Sanskrit words. So, but really, whenever you think about this section, it's really about class sequencing. It's about being able to understand how to build a sequence. And for a 200-hour class, really getting in there and understanding a little bit about what your class is, some of the limitations within your class, but then on top of that, moving forward with some type of class that will be advantageous to the people who are in front of you. I mentioned this earlier off the recording is today you will have every basic thing that you need to get a basic class in front of people and start teaching after today's class. We're going to be going over sequencing. We're going to go over a class example, maybe even two, and then we have a blank sequencing sheet that you all will be working on. In the afternoon is really going to be focused. Instead of really using a PowerPoint, we're going to use the Hatha book, which I put in the invite. So if you show up, that Hatha book really breaks down how, like each pose, it shows contraindications, it shows everything. So we're going to be kind of diving into that book, how to use that book and engaging your sequences and things like that. So that's really kind of what we're looking at. There's also another book that we will not be going over, but I highly recommend as you're kind of developing sequencing, and that's that 2100 of asanas. I'll show it here in a minute and kind of show y'all where those books are and things like that. But I'll say that that book right there is kind of the gold standard, the 2100 asanas. And the reason why I don't teach off of that one is whenever they start to break down the poses, they don't really show in depth everything that you need for that pose. They don't show the contraindications. They don't show to move with breath and things like that. So, but the Hatha book does. So that's the reason why I'll be using that book. But again, there's 2100 poses in yoga, right? In just that one book, there's way more than that. So we will not be learning all poses here, but we're going to get you familiar enough with those books that you'll be able to dive into those books and be able to find the poses that you need. Let's see, any questions to that portion of the class today before we kind of jump in and I start sharing my screen? Lost a chat. Hold on one second. My screen froze. I can't help with that. Let's see if I share though, if it'll stop here. I'll go ahead and look and show y'all Teams right now to where y'all can find all this material. Okay, so everybody here should be in the WAS District Wellness Council, and within that council, you all should have general, and most of you should have all of you should have the 200-hour yoga teacher training. Some of you may have different ones, but ultimately this is the one you should be looking at. Whenever you click on it, you'll see where we've been posting some things, but then under files, you'll see that we have modules, and then go down to Asana, and then today you'll find today's PowerPoint, which is Intro to Asana, the class sequencing sheet, and then the class example. Now what I've done is under sequencing is we're going to start adding overall, whenever you all are developing your sequences, we're actually going to start dropping these into these different places. So whenever you all create a sequence that you all want to teach and it feels like it's pretty good, you'll be able to drop it in here under elementary if you're an elementary school teacher and be able to really add that in there. So that's kind of the purpose of these. Right now, I have one in here for low back pain and a sleep sequence. We'll continue to add to it. I have a chair sequence I'll probably add in here. It's a chair sequence that you can do with anybody, but I've always had it marked as a chair sequence for elderly people. So that's the reason why I'll put it under specialty. But really it's a chair sequence for anything, and a lot of times these sequences are for anybody. Also, the books will be PDFs to learn poses. Sorry, these are not books. These are just different things that I've kind of broken down over time that will kind of show you how to really say the sequence, what modifications, and then any notes you may have as you're developing it. So we'll probably use these as homework sometimes, but if you ever are like, man, I looked in the Hatha book and the locust pose was just not really doing it for me in there, you can kind of come here and I've added some different types of modifications here. Also a different maybe lens of how to actually say the pose, but it'll probably be pretty similar to what's in the Hatha book. Maybe not the 2100 poses because they're not as in depth, I feel like, but definitely the Hatha book will probably be pretty similar as far as what this does, but maybe you might find some more modifications. And then, of course, if you find more, please put notes down here, right? If you're like, hey, I really found that, putting a block right here underneath the chest really helped, right? To be able to get them into this pose. By all means, start adding these notes in here because this is only going to be helpful for all of us. The other piece that I'll say is whenever you're here, go under, so you're all the way back at the beginning. So, right here under files, go to administrative documents, and research and reading documents is where you will find all of the the books that I'm talking about and referencing. So 2100 asanas. This one is this book here. Again, if you look up books on asanas, this is probably one of the number one books that is recommended, the 2100 asanas book. The reason why, in my opinion, is because it literally names 2100 asanas, 2100 poses, right? No other book really does that. So it's a book to where you can find a plethora or a in-depth knowledge of just the asanas themselves. But if you kind of start to break down, let's see if we can get down in here to where the poses are. Whenever you look at the pose, it's really just a PowerPoint slide, right? And it doesn't really give you much on modifications. It doesn't give you much on that. So that's the reason why whenever we teach, I don't really teach off of this one. Maybe in the 300-hour class we would, but here in this one, I feel like we need a little bit more instruction. So the Hatha book illustrated really breaks this down a little bit better for us. So in the afternoon, we'll really be focused here. Let me get to the poses. So here you can kind of see just from the very beginning, it kind of gives you some of the underpinnings. It gives you the physical benefits, the mental benefits, and then it gives you a more in-depth process of how to flow through that particular pose. So again, and then it gives you the other variations of kind of to do as well. So that's the reason why I choose this book instead of the other one, in case anybody ever wants to know. Hatha, which we hadn't learned yet. Hatha is one of the paths of yoga. So the reason why a lot of people won't use this book is because it's kind of limiting in its perspective, because it's one of the paths of yoga, not an eclectic look at it. So it's kind of narrowed down into one path of yoga. But I like it because of all of the things that I said, right? It really talks and walks you through all those poses. Let's see. Hopefully, Bianca, that answered your question on the books on where you can find them. So they're in there. We have a school-based yoga programs here. That's really more of a research article that I added a while back. So if y'all want to kind of see about starting yoga programs in your own schools, then this is a great article to kind of read, right? It really breaks down the grades. It doesn't do it in one place, like elementary or middle. They didn't combine middle and high schools like a lot of places do in studies. So it's a good study to kind of look at and kind of start to think about your own yoga programs in your schools. Yoga ebook, same thing. This one is through the NIH, but a good place for research and kind of understanding some things. And I think it's a little bit better and broken down for, how to really start to teach yoga, right? Kind of talks about doing yoga with children in here. Yoga for older adults. We'll dive more into this next Tuesday because I think that's when we do our advanced sequencing class, right? So then we'll start talking about sequencing for particular populations. Okay, let's see, any questions right now? All right, let me get the PowerPoint up and going. If you do have questions, you can unmute or put it in the chat. I'm still trying to monitor both. All right, here is my PowerPoint. I'll say me and this PowerPoint had a lot of issues over the weekend. It just like disappeared on me. And then it said it was encrypted, so I can't even change it now. So what we see is what we got, and I'll go back and fix it later if there's any corrections that need to happen. But it was a pain in my butt this weekend. So now let me go here. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this. We're still recording. We're good. Okay. So now we're going to jump in here and kind of focus on intro to asanas. Today's learning objectives, I will say too, anything that we don't get done today in class, for this first morning class, we will then kick to the afternoon naturally. But again, the afternoon will probably be less PowerPoints and more focused on the book. And then we'll be doing breakouts as everybody kind of goes out and then learns different poses, teaches those different poses. And then also by the end of that, we'll do a class sequence by the end of that class. What I will say on this is everything that we do is building on one another. So your yoga sutras that you did for that homework, right? Those are yoga sutras that you should really be integrating into your sequence, right? Breath work is breath work that is kind of grounding and starts off any type of yoga practice, right? Kind of inwardly focused, which is how you kick those things off, and then also how you progress through your entire asana and sequence. And now we're learning how to put those sequences together, what goes into a sequence and things like that. So we're going to be defining those things and trying to see how that fits, and then how it fits in a sequence and how it flows in yoga. And then we're going to build sequences based on the arc and peak pose, and that may come in the afternoon. So thanks to yoga, I gently stretch to conclusions instead of jumping to them, right? So, right, we are now going to start to think about how these things build in real life. And now that we're starting to really pull this together, right? We started, like I said, with Yoga Sutras, kind of some big overarching philosophies. And then now we're going to be moving into more like, how does this really function? And then how do we relate this to their everyday life? Part of it is not jumping to conclusions, just FYI. We stretch to them. All right, so now kind of going back to this, right? I said multiple times we'll be kind of going back to these 8 limbs of yoga, because, you know, the Yoga Sutras and those different things. But overall, this is a philosophy that is kind of stretched against all those pathways that we talk about. So already we have talked about pranayama, right? The breathing practices like we talked about. We've talked a little bit about the dharana, concentration, and the dhyana, which is the meditation. Some we've built a little bit into the pure consciousness, right? Because that's part of the meditation practices that we talked about, right? Of having some of that. And also a little bit of the disassociation of external environments, because that comes in with meditation as well. We'll dive more into these on Friday as well, just because we're going to be doing very similar to what we're going to be doing this afternoon, which is teaching a little bit more about pranayamas, but it's going to be a lot of practice on Friday. And then today is asanas. The next things that we'll really be focused on is the yamas and niyamas. We won't be doing that this week. I think it actually comes a few weeks from now that we'll probably be introducing the yamas and niyamas. Does anybody have any questions on the 8 limbs of yoga? Because this is extremely important in how we structure everything that we do, and need to ensure that we kind of hit all of these elements whenever we're practicing yoga. Starting to get real. That's right. That's right. It's starting to get real. Okay, and then now the koshas, right? I want to talk about the koshas, especially whenever we talk about asanas. So whenever we talk about sequencing and those types of things, right, we have the physical body, right, which is the Annamaya kosha. We have breath work, right, pranayama, feelings and emotions, maniyama, cognitions and beliefs, and then bliss and joy. And then this one is solely just eye rest, right? You'll see these 5s in all kinds of old philosophies and teachings and all kinds of things. But whenever we start to integrate this into our sequencing, right, you start by doing the physical body, right? So you're looking inward. So you're focused on the breath, and you look inward towards the body. Another way that we do this is whenever we meditate and we rotate through the body. But whenever we start to get into sequencing, the physical body is also whenever we're using our poses, right? So you can kind of connect that to that. Then, of course, all of our breath work. If we start off with a huge breath work of 3 different breath work practices, from alternative nostril breathing to diaphragmatic breathing to box breathing, right? Those are what we're doing is we're cultivating that energy and we're bringing out that energy so that we can get ready for the movement inside of our body. Feelings and emotion. A lot of times we're trying to bring that down, right? So we're adding that into, or maybe calm. Maybe we're talking about calm here, and then here we're trying to tame down or focus on positiveness whenever we get into cognitions and beliefs. And here is really just bringing this to the forefront, right? I think more now than ever, we need to focus on bliss and joy, especially in times of uncertainty and things that feel out of our control. And then ego and I-ness, this is really just trying to fight that ego and trying to partner with the ego, but then also recognize that you're separate from your ego as well, just like you're separate from all these different pieces. So whenever you look at these koshas, remember, these are different ways of looking at the self, right? The physical self, the energy self, the emotional self, the cognitive self, the bliss self, and then your ego-ness. Now, this is a little bit, I don't think we've talked about the chakras at all. So if you have ever studied yoga at all, you'll see and know that there is a huge chakra overlap. And if I could really say one thing about yoga or about the chakras is that the chakras is really a place of meditation. So a lot of times people really get confused a lot by the chakras. And whenever you think about that, sorry, my computer's not working with me here. The chakras is really a place that you hold meditation, especially at a 200-hour level, right? So whenever you think about the chakras, think about that. Is whenever you're looking at it, you're thinking, oh man, the root chakra is a place that we're going to hold this meditation. And then you have the overlap, which I like to always show here, between the Annamaya kosha and the root chakra, right? So as you kind of go up through these, right, you have the sacral chakra, right? And then you have pranayama. A lot of times whenever we breathe from this place. I could argue that it's right here as well, where the Annamaya kosha is. But a lot of times whenever you tell somebody, you're like, man, you're like, I feel depressed. Where do you feel that? They feel that right here, right? So, or if they feel something. So that's the reason why it's really overlapped with more of that mental one as well, right? That feelings and cognition. And then we have the heart chakra, right? And then, this one is more of that knowledge. And then we have the throat chakra right there, and that's the Annamaya kosha. And then I would argue that whenever we look at the crown chakra, that this one would be the overlap with the I-ness, the ego kosha, right? That this one would kind of overlap there. You don't see it too much because that is really a newer topic within the last 20 years. So you won't see the overlap whenever you show these overlapping koshas. You'll only see these overlaps whenever it comes to the 5 sheets. So anyway, any questions? We'll get more into chakras as we move on. But I would definitely say if you could learn anything at a 200-hour level, if anybody says, how do you integrate chakras and energy work into the flow of your sequence, it would solely be that these are a place of meditation, right? It's a place to hold and hold for meditation within your sequence. So much more than that. I don't want to downplay it, but that is really at a 200-hour level what you should really understand as moving out of this. And there's so many different things that you can focus on, right? There's different meditations, which we'll talk about later on, or maybe even some today, of, hey, I'm focused on the root chakra. This is a pelvic floor exercise, and this is how I'm going to implement it, right? And things like that. So anyway, just wanted to kind of talk about that. If you do have questions about that, please, let me know. I will say if you truly want to learn more about chakra work and how to do this energetic work, yoga is not the place to do it. And a lot of yogis would probably yell at me for saying that, but it's not. The place to really learn chakra work, if this really calls to you, is to be a Reiki master or a Reiki practitioner. And if you're not familiar with Reiki, Reiki really is a energetic work of I was almost going to say art, but it's not really, I guess you could call it an art. It's really energetic work. You don't need to touch people, but you're really working with the energetic work and you're really working on the chakras. You do things like crystal work to where you might put a crystal on the chakra, but you're not going to touch the chakra, right? It's not your job as a Reiki practitioner to touch anything, right? It's really just energetic healing work. And a lot of times what you'll do is you'll put your hands above these different chakras or maybe places that they're hurt, and then you're hovering above it and you're using that energy work to be able to try to heal. Um, However, the main root of everything, there's like four different kinds of Reiki. All of those are rooted in chakra and energy work. So no matter which one you picked, you're going to learn the same type of things. They're just maybe a different flavor in, how they talk about channeling that energy or things like that. So, but overall, if you go into Reiki work, you'll learn a whole lot more about chakras. And I put this together over the weekend on trying to kind of show how things flow together with yoga. We have yoga practices here, right? The postures, the breathing, relaxation, meditation. Really, we could probably put the 8 limbs of yoga up here and call it what it is, right? 8 limbs of yoga. So we start with the 8 limbs of yoga. And then whenever we start to think about what do you get from the 8 limbs of yoga, you get fitness, right? You get self-regulation, you get awareness. I would even probably say self-awareness. And then you also get some spirituality. Um, Whenever we look at this, these are the things that increase in those particular domains as we grow forward. And then you have global human functioning, right? You have the physical and mental and physical performance, stress, awareness, right? And these are the results. So this is kind of the benefits, and this is going to be your results. I thought it was a good way to kind of show it that no matter which path you come into yoga, you will still get these benefits and you will still get this overall, well, I guess this benefit, you'll still get, these actions and these overall benefits. So I think it's very important to show people this, that I would say 99% of people enter yoga through a physical domain, right? They either want to get healthier, they want to increase flexibility, increase strength, whatever it is, and this is their path to get into yoga. But as a consequence to that, they're going to get self-regulation, they're going to get awareness and spirituality. Now, I will also argue that if you do enter yoga in spirituality, which is very low, right? Maybe more overseas, maybe more in India, maybe more in other countries, you might see that people might enter this way. Then you're still going to get all these other benefits, right? No matter which way you enter yoga, whether it's like, man, I just need to regulate my stress, and I know yoga kind of slows things down, it slows up those postures, and it builds resilience, and this is why I want to go in. Well, you're still going to get more fitness, right? You're still going to get more awareness, and you're still going to get that. And then the overall benefit of global human functionality. Does anybody have any questions about this diagram? I think it's really important to show people the benefits, right? And I think it's important to let people know that it's okay to come to yoga just for fitness, because most of the people come to yoga. It's $1 billion business because people come to it for fitness, right? Not because they come to it for spirituality. It never would be what it is today if this was the 99% way that people got into it, or one of these other ones. Sorry, I don't want to just pick on spirituality, but even if it was awareness, right? If people were only coming to yoga for awareness, it would not be the $1 billion business that it is. So we have to recognize that fitness is one of the key areas that we have to, realize, acknowledge, and then talk to people about it. Like, just because you're here for fitness, that's great, but you're also going to get self-regulation. You're going to get awareness. You're going to maybe gain a sense of spirituality, not religion, right? Definitely distinguish between those two. All right, so now let's jump into asanas, right? And this is, oh man, I feel like I'm missing a slide here now. But really, an asana is is holding a pose, right? And it is more about going into and holding a pose. And holding it for whatever particular time doesn't necessarily matter. But I would say the key is always that you will not hold your breath in the pose, right? So whenever we talk about, and you'll see a lot of yoga teachers do this, even in front of the class, they'll be modeling it to where they will be moving from pose to pose and they're not incorporating the breath, right? I would argue that no movement is a movement, is a yogic movement if there is no breath that is associated with it. So whenever you think about that, every single time you move, if you say, as you move your arm straight up, right? You'll say inhale, your arm goes up. Exhale, your arm comes down, right? So as you move, every move comes with the breath. If you're going to stand in mountain pose, right, you're going to say inhale. And then if you're going to say now you're going to fold forward, right, now you say exhale, fold forward, right? Every single move that you make should be associated with the breath. Now, what I will say is, do you have to say that every single time? I would say no. However, as a new teacher, I would say yes, right? Get in the habit of it because you don't want to forget about the movement with breath. I think it's the most important part. So, and then, when in doubt, exhale and fill it. This is one thing that I'll say is if you lose track of your thoughts, you'll hear me say this a couple times, especially as new teachers, right? I'll say when in doubt, right? Go back to a sun salutation. If you lose track of your entire sequence in your head, there's going to be certain things that you'll be able to do. And I think one of them is if you're like, oh shit, what do I do next? Have I already done this? And you're kind of stuck in this thing and this idea in the back of your head that you're not doing something right. And then you sit on that, right? Then it's time to take an exhale yourself, right? Be genuine in the moment. Say, all right, we're going to take a breath and, do whatever you need to, do whatever type of breathing practice. It's okay. And then kind of regroup yourself. Let me see. So instant yoga, right? If you had nothing else to do and you had no sequence in front of you, you weren't prepared, nothing. This is almost an instant yoga thing that you could easily do. And that is set some type of attention, right? Usually with a breath practice, do a 3-part breath, do 2 full forward bends, do 2 backward bends, probably 1 forward bend, 1 backward bend, 1 forward bend, and 1 backward bend. And then do a twist, some type of seated twisting breathing, inversion, maybe having your legs straight up in the air while you're on your back, right? Nothing too strenuous. And then do a meditation right afterwards. This would be easy enough, a very easy sequence that you could implement at the beginning of a class, a beginning of a meeting, right? And this right here, it could probably take 5 to 15 minutes, depending on how slow your sequencing is and how much time you give them in between. Very easy. I always say this because a lot of times one of the most overwhelming things for yoga therapists or yoga teachers is coming up with your class sequence, right? At the very beginning, people always struggle with like, oh man, what if I do this? Or what if I do this? And what I'll say is, yes, go do all those things, right? Mess it up, play with it, break it a little bit, because I guarantee you, you're not going to hurt anybody by doing these right here. We'll talk about some contraindications, right? Because pregnant women, you may not do inversions, things like that. But there are some contraindications to some of these things. But overall, you will not hurt anybody by doing this type of sequence. Something that we'll talk a lot about is props. Hopefully everybody has their yoga mats, blankets, what else? Straps and bolsters. You may or may not have the bolster. They came in after we got the other stuff. So, but if you don't have anything, let me know. The bolsters, we're still kind of delivering some of those out, but let me know if you don't have a bolster and or any of that other equipment and you still need it. We'll get those out there, but I'm pretty sure most people should have it. But we're going to be working a lot with props, right? Because whenever, this is another key thing that I'll say, and whenever we get to the phase to where we're coming up with the overarching peak pose that you're going to be going with, that peak pose you should really offer three variations of that peak pose. Meaning, if you're doing, I think we get into the example, I think we're doing Warrior 3, right? Well, then in Warrior 3, you may have something like this there instead of blocks, right? So you may tell them to step up on this. That would be one variation. And then another variation may be um, that you have their feet closer together, right? And then another variation, especially in like a warrior pose, would be to rotate. A lot of people always have their hands down. Well, another variation could be that their arms are up, right? They might have shoulder issues to where their rotation isn't the same as everybody else's, and they may be more zen to have their arms facing up. So that could be another variation. So kind of remember, anytime you're at that peak pose, you want to offer three different variations. You're not going to be able to do that all class for every single pose. I would say do it for every pose. If you're doing like a yin yoga or you're doing it very slow, you could be showing people exactly how to do that. But overall, I would say wait for that peak pose. At a bare minimum, I will say this actually, for your evaluation, right? If you do not offer three peak poses or three variations of your peak pose, you would be dinged on it. I wouldn't say you'd fail for that, but it would take a lot more probably than just that to fail. Um, but most certainly, right, you need to offer those three variations. Or even down here with pigeon pose, you see how they're on this with pigeon pose a little bit elevated. You could also do a figure 4 variation of that pigeon pose, right, which would be the second one. And then maybe even here, instead of doing this, you could offer them a blanket to where they're lower on the ground and getting in there. Another variation is making sure the hips are accurate, right? So then maybe you have them all the way on the ground with pigeon pose, but then on the other side of that hip, instead of it being on the ground, you may need to put a blanket under it, right? So there goes a way to use a prop. And then the good thing about using a blanket as a prop is whenever they're ready, you can loosen up a layer of one of those pieces of the blanket that gets them a little bit closer to the ground, right? And then a little bit more. That is the good thing, and the reason why everybody has blankets is because some things like this is a little bit too rigid, in my opinion, right? The blanket really helps to be able to get people where they want to be, kind of working on some of that lopsidedness in their hips and things like that. But we'll be talking a lot about props, probably more in our sequencing class, or we may do this asynchronous on kind of getting into those props and things like that. So curriculum. So this is an easy 6-week curriculum. It doesn't have to be this way, but I kind of want to show people whenever we look at the different asanas and the different groups of asanas, you'll see that they're kind of broken down in standing poses. So you could literally spend one entire week just on standing poses, right? If you're practicing every single day, maybe your peak pose is a new standing pose every single week that week, right? And then the next week would be back bends. And even if you're only meeting one time, it could still just be one time of this. But then what if you're doing, forward bends, right? So there's a whole slew of forward bends, inversions, twist, right? You could build an entire 6-week curriculum and do it pretty easily with coming up with a new peak pose every single time. And then a month curriculum, this is just a good example, is that entire month, your theme for that month is standing poses. So really you're going to be doing most of your peak poses as standing poses, and so on and so forth. And you could really do this over time. I will say I have never taught classes that way. I tend to incorporate it to where one week would be, one class would be standing poses, the next one would be back bends, the next class would be forward, and we kind of rotate over time in those ways. That's how I do it. Doesn't mean it's right. It's really, one thing that I will say probably over and over is there is no set curriculum that is a one-stop shop that is good. You'll hear people say it all the time in yoga. Core yoga is the best, right? Or Ashtanga yoga, or hot yoga, or yin yoga, and you'll hear all these different things. And I would say any yoga teacher that says this is the only way to practice and this will help anything, I would be weary of those types of yoga teachers. And I don't mean that too negative. It's just, I find that challenging if they're pretty rigid as a yoga teacher to say this is the only way to do it, right? In a field that is historically known for being more flexible, more adaptable, more client-centered. But again, you'll see that in the field a lot. And you'll also see in the field that people don't focus on the entire picture, right? And I think this gives it a really good vision of it, right? Is you can either go into the gym and get on a treadmill and be completely oblivious and mindless to the entire process that's going on with your body, which does that really may I will argue and say it does help overall with some of those things that was on that chart. I don't want to take anything away from it. If you're engaging in physical activity on this side and doing treadmills and things like that, even though you're not benefiting and practicing with intention on being mindful of that process, you're still getting a lot of those benefits, right? You're still gaining some clarity mentally. You're still doing that. It's just not as impactful as if you're doing it with intention, right? I think that's the difference. If I could show this, this would be without intention, with intention, right? And you could replace yoga and the treadmill with anything, in my opinion. Over here, you could say, this is cycling. Well, if you're going to go cycle, you're probably going to be a little bit more mindful of that experience. But if you set an intention going into it, and then you do a mindful integration afterwards, no matter, it doesn't matter what yoga is, right? It could be replaced with anything. If you're really setting an intention with it and focused on the wholeness of that entire process and how it impacts you, you're going to gain all those benefits that we talked about from spirituality, awareness, self-regulation, and fitness. So this is kind of some of the foundational principles of this, right? And really, that's the reason why I said earlier, right? The beginning stage, most people come through the beginning stages of really that physical body, right? You're starting to learn more about your physical body. You're starting to understand your physical body a whole lot more. What else here? You're really just starting to gain that understanding, right? But a lot of people in the field will say that that's just scratching the surface in yoga. Yoga is so much more than just the physical body that you're going to gain all those other pieces. So then you kind of move into this second stage. And in the second stage, you start to understand some of those mental qualities that are kind of coming with it, right? You're like, oh man, my mind, I'm able to concentrate a little bit more now. I'm able to get my task done because now I'm a little bit more intentional about those types of things. And you're like, oh man, this is really happening. And then the last stage, the increase stage, right? Here is really you're starting to notice it all around, right? You're starting to notice the physical aspects, the self-regulation, the awareness, and maybe even some of that spirituality is coming out. You're starting to see that this is a full mind body integration instead of just a physical practice or even a mental practice. Oh, and I do like this, right? You kind of start off with this Winnie the Pooh mindset, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to go get my honey, right? I'm going to go do these things. And you're just kind of man, I can't even talk, lollygagging around. And then all of a sudden you start to notice these other things, right? And then you become the full awareness Winnie the Pooh, right? A grand adventure is about to begin. And I think that mindset, that curious mindset of Winnie the Pooh, that curious mindset of kids, that curious mindset is really the great thing that I think yoga can create. And I will say yoga, really physical fitness can almost create in general, is that beginner mindset and that curious mindset. So here goes some more principles that are a little bit more straightforward, right? Try to set people in optimal alignment, then take them through the full range of motion. So here, we'll talk a little bit more about touching people. I may have said this before, but like touching people should always be a last resort. If they can't get into the posture, one thing to think about is if you can't talk them into the posture, more than likely you need to move on. I don't want to say it just flat out that way, but I do feel more than likely you just need to move on at that point. Moving from simple to complex, right? If you're doing a mountain pose, you need to get them into a mountain pose. But then if you're going to go to a tree pose, which is a little bit more complex of standing on one leg, right? While also trying to balance your leg touching the other leg. Like there's so many more complexities to that. You're going to start with the most simple pose first and then move to complexity. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you know, you also have to think about what you're going to open up. So, and what I mean by that is if your peak pose, which we'll talk about a little bit, is Warrior Three, well, there's a lot of things that you have to open up before you get there. You need to open up the hips, you need to stretch out the hamstrings, you need to open up the shoulders, and you also need to stretch out the shoulders, right? Because you're going to be moving those shoulders up. And if you're not really focused on those things, right, you're going to create a lot of tension as they move their arms up, and or their legs aren't going to be, or their hamstrings aren't going to be warmed up. So once you get into that warrior pose, then there's going to be a lot more unease for that person in that pose. So definitely have to think about that. Balance of all types of yoga. So here I added Iyengar here. He's not the only one, but he is most certainly one that says you cannot create balance in a single session. It has to be multiple sessions over time. Um, you know, we could probably sit here and argue that stance all day long, right? I think there's definitely poses you are things that you could do. I mean, just think about the regulation of one of your kids, right? Did you do something right in one time for one kid that they were able to regulate in that moment based on one little thing that you did? Absolutely. So to kind of say that you can't do it in one session, I think is bad. But I think really to create balance that is there in lieu of someone else or an external thing takes multiple sessions, right? So maybe that's the way we should say it is if you want somebody to intuitively understand self-regulation, they're not going to get that in one session, right? It's going to take multiple sessions over time. So maybe that's a better way to say it is maybe you might be able to regulate that kid in the moment or yourself or whatever for that particular moment with one particular pose, asana, breathing practice, whatever you want to add in there. However, that didn't really intuitively let them know that this is what's going to happen every single time, right? And there's so many different things that go into that, right? Because it takes people 7 times to learn or hear something before they retain it, right? And that's not even being able to put it into action. It takes them 7 times to be able to do that, to really hear it and understand it. Then it takes about 66 days to build a new habit, right? So overall, to think that only one session would be able to give you this instinct that you're going to be able to create new habits and do all these different things is fundamentally flawed from those two perspectives, that it takes on average 7 times to hear something before you retain it, and then 66 days to retain a new habit. So again, I don't want to take anything away from the different professions or yoga or lineage, whatever you want to call it, that says you can create balance in one day. I would just challenge it, right? I would say really it's going to take a whole lot more than that. And even science tells us that at the end of the day. Each class will focus on a segment. You know, this really is what you layer into that, right? Because this is kind of a layered effect of sequencing, whereas other styles focus on balance in a session, right? And what I mean by that is whenever you think about a client-centered approach, each session is uniquely tailored to them. But if you don't have an overarching target of what you're going for, this is the difference between that. If you have a 8-week class that you're really wanting to build resilience, every single class should be focused on resilience and have a theme of some type of resilience. And then you should layer it in through that whole process. Whereas if you really show up and only build a class at a time as you build it, you know, kind of like that, kind of like we're doing with this yoga teacher training, right? We're kind of building it as we go. You know, then you're going to really be missing a lot of things if you don't have the overarching target. And I think it's really important to think about that. And then, of course, moving from dynamic to static exploration is also very and extremely important. All right, so really kind of starting to talk about sequencing. We'll talk a little bit more about principles after this, but then we're really going to start talking about sequencing after that. And then whenever we jump into this, right, something you will always do in every single class, right? There is no doubt about this, like you will do it in every single class. Draw inward, right? And whenever you draw inward, what we're really saying too is you're setting an intention for the class, right? Whenever you're doing that breathing practice, you're also kind of, what is my intention for this particular class? And then you do some type of warm-up, a sun salutation, I don't do too many sun salutations all the time, but my warm ups kind of consist of like neck rolls, shoulder rolls, right? Just kind of warming up all the different types of joints that you're going to be impacting. And then the core of the class, which is really, the peak of the class and kind of the roadmap to get there. And then every single class should have rest and recovery. Most people call this Shavasana. Some people might call it a ending class meditation, whatever it is, right? Ultimately, if you go to a yoga class and their Shavasana is only like a minute, that's not a yoga class I would go to, right? Because they're not valuing the recovery and rest of what needs to happen. And that recovery and rest is not just physical, right? It's mental, right? You just went through a mental journey. If you're really focused on regulation in one class, right, and doing those types of things, recovery is also a mental recovery. And that's why that Shavasana is so important. I will say most classes that I teach, I save around 15 minutes, roughly 10 to 15 minutes for Shavasana. Some of that is guided, while a chunk of that is going to be completely quiet, so people can kind of integrate that practice into their day. So this is the overall. Now this is what I will say: a sun salutation, right? They have an A and a B. I think there's even a C out there. If you learn anything about sequencing, right, you will learn that you will lose your place in sequencing as you teach. Right? So when in doubt, always implement a sun salutation, right? It's a flow, it's an easy flow, it's easy to remember, it's very short in duration, so you could easily implement that. So if you're sitting here and you just got done teaching your Warrior 3, your peak pose, and then you're like, oh shit, I just forgot everything I was getting ready to teach. I have no idea what I'm doing. Where is my head right now? Right? A sun salutation is something that you should have that is automatic sequencing that you could say immediately focus on, right? So another thing to take away from this conversation here is that you really need to learn sun salutations, right? That is something that should almost be second nature to you to be able to implement into your practice, because when in doubt, implement a sun salutation, right? When in doubt, implement a breathing practice. There's so many different things that should be almost second nature to you that if for some reason those gremlins or that negative self-talk or whatever it is in your head that gets you distracted in the moment, that you'll be able to lean back on, re-engage yourself, and then realize what you need to do from there. Let's see, any questions about that? For some reason, I can't see the chat. So if y'all are putting the chat in here, he sent the link. Okay. Got it. Yeah, I should be able to print these out. And that should be good. Okay. All right. So I covered that. All right. So now let's move on. So some more teaching principles here, right? No one curriculum fits all. Again, I strongly believe going to some of these yoga studios that are like Ashtanga yoga or core yoga, if they're not really given a variety, that could be good for you. But if you're kind of feeling like you're hitting a plateau in your yoga, especially in those domains that we talked about, right? Spirituality, awareness, self-regulation, and fitness. If you're kind of feeling like it's not filling one of those buckets as you're going to yoga, I would go somewhere else, right? And I don't mean go somewhere permanently, but go somewhere else for a few days, right? It might be that you just need to kind of see what's out there and feel something different and then go back to the regular yoga that you're doing. It's perfectly okay. Another thing that I'll say as far as yoga curriculum doesn't fit all is if somebody in your class is doing something completely different than what you're saying, you know, that's a tricky situation sometimes, right? Because you're like, oh man, are they doing it because they're not understanding me and they're not in my class? Or are they doing it because they're listening to their body and they know that this class and some of the things that I'm saying is contraindicated to their body? And I'll give a good example. My lower back, my hips are cattywampus. There's going to be a class that I'm going to show this as we kind of talk. It might be actually the next Tuesday class. I'll show some of my x-rays of kind of like, with my hips being cattywampus, that means there's certain things that I can't do, right? I have a few things wrong with my lower back. So then doing like up dog and things like that are not things I like to do, or cobra pose or things like that. Like that's contraindicated really for my back and really hurts it. So then what do I do whenever they do those in class? I might go into a child's pose. I might do something different depending on what we're doing in the class. But it doesn't mean that I'm not a part of that class, right? So I think we really have to start distinguishing and knowing those types of things. And I'll also say for you all, as you go to a class and you notice that something doesn't fit your body in that class, you got to start learning that you don't do it, right? And give yourself permission to do that so that you can give people in your class permission to do that. Yeah, go ahead.
So do you give
Don.
that kind of in the beginning of each of your class where do what you're comfortable with? If you know a pose isn't right for you, please. Is that something you offer when you start your classes?
I actually say that at every beginning of every single class. Absolutely. I think that's a great way to do it. I think saying, something along those lines. And I would say, especially maybe with definitely with adolescents and adolescent boys, I would definitely say it more with them than I would other populations if we're working in our schools. And mainly anybody. I don't want to make it, but one thing that you'll see that hurts a lot of people, and I'm guilty of it myself, is I compete with people whenever I'm on the mat, right? Right. If I see somebody holding a push-up position longer than I am, then I'm frustrated, right? And then I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have to get them back later, right? And they don't even know that they're competing with me, whatever it is, right? So I would say, and again, I know, that anybody can be competitive by all means, but typically I see more injuries. Maybe that's a better way to say it. I see more injuries with adolescent boys than I do with others, just because of that competition style. Let's see. Yoga needs to fit into our lives, right? Yoga needs to fit organically, and that's part of that integration piece. Um, Thanks for letting me feel. Yeah, you're not alone in competitiveness, Emily, for sure. And I will say, I do that in life in general, right? Is everybody, if we're walking down the hallway, we're probably competing and you don't even know it. Right? Like I feel like that's just who I am. And I feel like that comes out on the mat for a lot of people. And then it can create injuries for sure. Hands-on adjustments should come last. So this is what I'll say, and this is my technique, and I'm sure you all use this technique for the teachers in the room. But the first thing that I do is if I'm in front of a class and I see somebody not in the pose that is in, and I've kind of in my head ran through the checklist that this isn't somebody who has injuries, this isn't somebody that has all that, right? So then they're not implementing the pose accurately. Then I will restate that pose again, right? I will just not call this person out, right? Not to do anything. I'm seeing somebody kind of off, maybe even two people. I'm going to repeat how to do this pose one more time. Now let's say I look over there and this one person is not in that position. There's two ways that I go about this. If I have time to walk around the classroom, I will walk over to them and then demonstrate the pose around them, right? And then maybe even say, hey, look at this, right? Maybe even give them a nudge and say, hey, look at this as I do this, but I'm doing it for the general class. I've just narrowed where I'm doing it in the class, right? So that's one way. The other way is if you can't walk around the class, whether you're online or whatever it is, I hate to do this just because I hate to call people out in particular in front of an entire class. But I would say, whoever it was, let's just say it was Brett or Don, I say, Don, you know, look at this as I kind of move my hip back to open it up. That's kind of what we're looking at, right? And then I'll do it. I wouldn't say it very, I wouldn't stay on it too long, kind of use some of that intuition of doing those types of things. But for the most part, I would kind of call it out. Now, let's say they're still not in that position. I would then move on, right? I usually would not call somebody out. I don't go and do hands-on adjustments. It's just not something I do. I won't say I have never done hands-on adjustments, but, you know, I keep it to, it's just a liability issue at the end of the day if you start touching people and especially if you're touching people's legs, right? And you're kind of in their lower back trying to open up a hip, right? That's pretty I don't know how to say it. It's just intrusive, right? It's just intrusive that some people you don't know if they have a trauma that they haven't disclosed to anybody ever. And then here you are grabbing them by the leg, I always think of, and I think we have a video that we'll show in our ethics class of this yoga instructor that grabbed this person's leg and their shoulder and was basically holding them up against their body the entire time, right? And needless to say, that person ended up getting sued because their genitals was touching the back of another person, right? Whether it was exposed genitals, the whole 9 yards, but it made that person feel very, very, very uncomfortable. And granted, that's a typical adjustment that yoga teachers do on a regular basis to try to show people how to align their bodies and things like that. Again, I say don't do it, right? And it's just something I would not do. The 9 second rule, right, is whenever they are kind of off, wait 9 seconds and see if they kind of correct themselves, right? Don't correct it right away. They may feel it themselves, right? They'll be like, oh man, this hip is just not working. Like, how do I do it? And you may see them kind of starting to correct it themselves. I feel like there's no need to call people out for things like that. If they're moving in that effort, do that. But I'll say if they're not getting it 100% of the time, you should talk to them after class, is really what it should boil down to. So instead of stopping the class and trying to get this one person to get into this position or this pose, I would never do that, right? I would just kind of move on. And then afterwards, just kind of say, hey, I seen that you were kind of struggling in that Warrior 3. You mind if we work on this and I can give you some exercises and stretches that might be able to help you open up that hip to where next time you'll be able to get that, right? And then kind of work on them, give them some homework around that. Let's see, any questions around that side of the things? Because I feel like some of that, you all may have some expertise that you all can lean on in seeing kids who aren't doing things in their class, especially probably the PE teachers. I would say lean on some of that experience, right? Not to call people out, not to humiliate, not to shame, right? These poses are hard and we have no idea how often somebody may not have stretched in their entire, younger lives. And then now this is the first time that they're doing it. So, it really could be just something as simple as that. Okay. So kind of moving on to the arc of the sequence, right? And really, whenever we think about the arc of the sequence, what lies beyond us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. And I think every time we think of our yoga and we think of creating a sequence, we should not just think about the physicalness of that sequence, right? We should go back to that entire whole process. And again, for your evaluation, right, you will have to incorporate yoga sutras, right? You'll have to incorporate pranayama, right? You're going to pretty much incorporate the entire 8 limbs of yoga in your sequence. And the goal of that is to create a process that allows them to look inwardly, that then hopefully gains some self-awareness and self-regulation and those other pieces. Sorry, my dog came in and was whining. But now let's move on into the arcs, right? So as we kind of think about that and we think about the entire arc, right? The yoga sutras that we're going to be adding into it, the pranayamas, the poses, everything. For your evaluation for a 200-hour class, this is the one that we'll be looking at. So just this one. So we're only going to be looking at a single peak class. Now, what we'll do, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about next Tuesday, is some of these other ones, right? Now, if we were in a 300-hour class, you would probably be evaluated off of one of these two, a 2 peak class or a multiple peak class. For those who teach elementary school, I think like Emily probably teaches elementary school. I know some of you all are. Whenever you think about that, I would venture to say elementary school, you're probably going to be teaching classes like this, right? And the main reason why is because your kids don't have the attention span to focus on a peak class that would be a 45-minute class or an hour-long class to where you're building up to 1 peak, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but I would imagine that would probably be the case. So you would probably be working off this probably a 3-pronged approach of peak class, right? But you could also think of it in this way for those types of classes that you'll be building is, right, this first peak could literally be some major breathing practice for them, right? It could be that you're implementing the butterfly breathing technique to where they're crossing their arms and doing all this tapping and doing things, and that could be your first peak Then the next one could be a pose, right? Let's just say for your kid, it could be moon pose, or what would be another good one for kids? Anything really that kind of creates flexibility, stability, and those types of things. Because really, with kids, they need to maintain that stability. So maybe here you have some pose that is really focused on stability. And then at the end, instead of really focused on a pose, maybe it's a pose within meditation, right? You have them in child's pose as they're meditating. So you're building up to child's pose. That is the peak of that meditation, right? So then you have three peaks with inside of your practice for those kids. And then let's say you're teaching high school, because I would say high school would probably fall into maybe not this either, right? To where it's only one peak. So maybe here in high school, you may still have a breathing practice, but these next two peaks are really poses. Or maybe all three for high school is poses because they're so energetic that they need to get that out. So then it's like here you're doing a warrior two pose, here you're doing a moon or half moon pose, and then here you're doing a headstand, right? Or something along those lines to get these kids really active. And then you're really building this up over time. So whenever you look at this path, right? Initial warming, path to the peak, and peak exploration, and then integration, that would come with each one of those. So you would see initial warming up, path to the peak, peak pose, integration, then flow back into that, right? So then you'll have another warm up to where you're going to be opening up, path to the peak, peak performance, integration, so on and so forth, right? So you'll see that in every single class that you do, regardless. So each time you see a peak, you'll still be doing that, even if that peak is very small. You'll still do the integration. But then if you're doing a two peak class to where this isn't so much of a peak, right? Then what I would argue is that here, if you're doing like a warrior two pose, and now you've opened up the hips and you've opened up the shoulders and you've done all that, you don't have time to open up all those things again. So you're probably going to do something that has to do with opening up those shoulders and those hips because you're not going to have time to do all that other integration or all that warming up and path to the peak. So it may be, that you're opening up the hips, you're doing different things. You're opening up the back and shoulders, and then you do warrior two pose. Then you do some type of integration, and then maybe you do some type of hip opening again, and then you do warrior three, right? And then that way you don't have such a warm up to or pathway to that next peak, that you can do it pretty fast and not mess anybody up or pull a hamstring or do something because you didn't stretch it out. Let's see, does anybody have any questions about these three kind of ways to arc your class? Gradual, I would say this would be like a restorative one down here. There's not really a set peak per se, but you're just kind of flowing over time. And it's just more of kind of like an energetic flow type of class of you're sitting in poses for 3 to 5 minutes instead of, just a few seconds, or 30 seconds to a minute. All right, sounds good. So this is a basic template. And I will say every single class, the reason why I have not taught you all a class yet, which is probably going to come either Friday or next week, is because I want you all to have the basics of understanding a class. So whenever we teach a class, you can see where that arc was, you can see the pathway to the arc, you can kind of see it all. So again, kind of pulling it all together. But I start every single class that I teach with a seated meditation. And in that seated meditation, we actually come up with what your three-part sankalpa is, or your three-part intention for that practice is. We have one intention that is your heartfelt desire, that is like your overall purpose in life. We have an intention that you're going to set for this practice, and we're going to talk about an inward resource that you can have, right? Much like the IRS practices that you kind of start with there. And then we have our initial warming up, right? Which is just kind of, downward dog, cat cow stretches. Again, I may or may not do sun salutations, but I am going to do something like a sun salutation, right? It may not be this exactly, right? Because like I said, I got some health issues that I may not do upward dog, right? So like I'm not going to do the sun salutation, things like that. So ultimately you'll see some variation of a warm up, and then you'll see some standing poses. We might start really with some sitting poses, but you'll see like start moving into some of those things to where we're rotating the hips externally. rotating the hips internally, especially if we're going to be doing like warrior poses, right? Or triangle poses or some of those types of standing poses, we're going to open that up. You'll see on here that core strengthening is optional. It's optional by the standards of yoga. I would say and argue that if your class is full of kids, you should have every single class doing some type of core strengthening. I would even add sit-ups in there, or maybe not sit-ups, but maybe crunches or whatever kind of calls to you in your practice. Um, but we have boat pose on here, forearm plank. I would also say that as you're building your poses, do not think that you have to stick to yoga poses and exercises. And what I mean by that is if you see push ups and you want people to bring their elbows and knees together as you're doing the push ups, do it, right? Do that plank pose, right? And get them to do those things. They're kids, especially if you're doing it with kids, right? They got all the energy in the world. They're flexible, keep them that way, right? So I would say definitely incorporate that. If you're doing a bird dog technique for some core and some stretching exercises, right? Go ahead and bring those knees and elbows together, those opposite knees and elbows together to create more of a core strengthening exercise, right? Use some of the things that you may already know, especially for those PE teachers and folks like that that may have other credentials too. Remember that. Arm balances. I do skip these a lot of times, and the main reason why is because I'm not going to have people balance on their arms if I have not done a thorough assessment of how strong their shoulders are and things like that to hold themselves up. Now, maybe I do a side plank. I think that's good, but this crow pose I would probably never do, especially the first time I teach a class. But definitely a side plank, I think that would be good enough. You could see the stability in their shoulders and things like that. And if they fall, they're not falling too far. It's not a whole bunch of weight solely on their shoulder as well, things like that. So kind of think about those things as you're going through these motions as well. Back bends. Remember what I said about back bends. Some people may have back issues, right? We do have a high veteran population in Colorado Springs and in District 2. I think even in our employees, right? We have a high veteran population. So low back pain is going to be something that we have to worry about. And elements within that low back pain, like maybe a cattywampus hip or even some degenerative disc disorders and things like that. We're going to see those things. Twist here. For the most part, anybody can do a twist as long as you're doing it safely, right? Even pregnant women can kind of do this twist, but they should not be doing a forced twist. Nobody should ever do a forced twist. It should be a natural twist that you move with your breath. But there's several of these. I would say a speeding or a sitting spine twist might be okay for a pregnant person, but maybe a revolved triangle is not going to be good because that takes balance. That takes a whole lot more. So, if you're going to do things, definitely think about your population. Again, hopefully we're not doing too much with pregnant folks in our school districts, but it definitely is there, right? For sure. And definitely if we're going to be doing them with faculty and staff, our teachers and staff. Forward bends and hip openers, right? Seated forward bend, pigeon pose is a great one for hip openers. Butterfly pose, same thing. Inversions, here, I will say I do not do too many headstands. I do as yoga therapy whenever I'm working one-on-one with people. It's great for drainage. It's great for all different kinds of things, but also very dangerous at the same time. So same thing with shoulder stands. If you don't really know how to use your shoulder stands well and they're not ready for a shoulder stand, you can really hurt somebody. So with inversions, I always start with legs up the wall to see how people handle that first before I do anything. So if it's your very first class with a group, and I would definitely start here. Now, if you've been working with a group for 10 weeks and you're like, man, this group is gung-ho, I know that half of them can do headstands, then do the headstands. For people who can't do headstands, have them do a forward fold or some type of like monkey pose or I can't remember the hanging baby pose. I'm trying to remember all the names, but just kind of how they're just there dangling, right? Do some type of inversion with them just so they can get some of that drainage as well. And then of course, corpse pose is really Shavasana. And you can do different types of meditative poses. I've even done mindful walking poses so that people can do that as well at the end. It doesn't have to be laying down. A lot of people thinks it does, but as long as you leave time at the end for people to process that session, right? It could be walking, it could be laying down, it could be doing anything, but as long as it's a mindful style moment. Every class should also have a theme, right? So the theme of every class matters a lot. I feel like it matters a lot. Some people will say that this isn't a big one, but there should be a theme for your class. So if somebody's showing up to your class and you're teaching, let's just say it's kids, you may not be talking to them about the cosmos, right? But you may talk to them about nature, right? And how nature can influence their behaviors. How many people are starting to feel like, man, the hell with Colorado too, right? Because of all the snow. I didn't even know that today was going to be a bad day, right? And then I'm learning that February is like the worst month in Colorado. It's almost like I almost put on here. I don't know how many people have seen Anchorman, but whenever at the end or towards the end, they said, Ron Burgundy said, F you, San Diego, and had no idea that he sent it, and then everybody was mad. I feel like Colorado's the same way. Like if you were like, man, Colorado sucks, and everybody would jump on you. Everybody loves Colorado, except for the month of February. Then everybody will join. But yeah, the hell with this place. It's cold as hell. We don't want to be here. Nope. Can't even get outside, right? So, I think it's important for us to kind of incorporate nature into our practices, long story short, right? All jokes aside, that the seasons do matter, right? The month of February is a hard season for people in Colorado who's been locked in their houses over the weather, wanting to get back outside. That's normal, right? But also in the summertime, it's also normal to feel exhausted, right? Because you're going 100 miles an hour, don't know what to do, there's more engagement, there's all kinds of things, right? So incorporating that and understanding the phases and those types of things, I would just say study it before you go out and implement it into your practices. If you're a person that really focuses on, I'm trying to think of what they call it, but this constellations, right? If the constellations impact you, incorporate it in here, right? This would be a good place to do it and create a theme around it. However, just know that the theme and know the impact and know it, right? Just do some research on it before you put it out there. Um, Archetypes and methodology. Here there's so many different ways that you could go about this. You could literally, in my opinion, add stoicism to this, right? You could add Christianity. It doesn't have to be some of these other pieces of different things along those lines, right? And I know that gets a little bit harder inside of our school system by the separation of church and state and those types of things in some of the areas and getting tricky with that. So we definitely approach this with caution for sure. And then definitely with the different types of asana families, right? You could almost have an entire, theme on back bends, right? And then I would even take this further to say transitions, asana transitions, because I think the biggest things that we want to show our kids and people, anybody that does yoga, is the transition to their life, right? Off the mat. There's on the mat. You'll hear a lot in yoga that's on the mat, off the mat, right? So how do you take things from on the mat to off the mat? And I think one thing to show kids or people in general is that how smooth things can be during transitions, right? So you transition from warrior one to warrior two, such a smooth transition. That, in my opinion, is one of the easiest translatable things that can come out of yoga is you just transition from one thing to another so easily, so smoothly by just breathing through that process and you found your way, right? That alone, in my opinion, can be such a theme, and especially for a lot of our kids, and especially in times of uncertainty and transitions that they can't even control in their lives, right? Gives them a little bit of autonomy back in some of those things. So translating what is on the mat to off the mat, right? So getting there. And then of course the chakras. And here we can say all different kinds of things about these chakras. But I think the number one thing is, again, remember that this is a place of energy, but also you don't have to call them chakras, right? If it's a root chakra and you're really focused on grounding, right? You could say this is our grounding week or whatever you want to call it. This is our rooting week. And then really you're focused, you as a practitioner, as a yoga person that's coming to this class, you are bringing the details of that chakra, right? But you don't have to call it a chakra, right? You don't have to call it the things that it is to where kids may not want to engage in that process. And that's the reason why I say, and the reason why a lot of times you don't hear me using a Sanskrit. One is I sometimes can't say them myself. I don't want to take away that I'm avoiding the word because I don't know how to say it. But then the second part is, you know, maybe some of our kids, maybe this is a language that they understand and they know how to break these words down and they can do it. I don't want to, but I would say for the bulk of people that we're going to be teaching to, chakras is going to be a foreign term for them. It is going to be something different. A lot of Sanskrit terms that we use will kind of be a foreign term to them. So kind of relating it back to, if you're doing elementary work versus high school work with doing yoga or even just doing teacher wellness, those are three different styles of what you may use instead of chakra. Let me see what is next. Okay. And then here, right, so deepening the integration. I think I've beat this a little bit is create space for rest. Again, I start every practice with rest, and then I end every practice with rest. And then my arc is typically some type of pose in between all that. I just think it's better, right? And then create space for renewed self-awareness, right? Give that long or that brief and long pauses during transitions, right? Connect to that self-awareness piece of things to say that these transitions are so smooth that you can take this outside the mat, right? Or off the mat or something along those lines. And I'll also add that whenever you're doing your peak pose, so let's just say all your other poses, you're giving them 30 to 60 seconds only in those poses. Once you get to your peak pose, that should really be several minutes in that pose. And they should really be exploring it because that is what you've built up to. They should sit there and savor that time, right? They should use all three of those alternatives that you might put out there, right? They should really be exploring that particular pose because that is where you built them up to go. And then you start to go back down. So again, create that space for that self-assessment to say, this is a pose that I can use, and then maybe throw things out there that are kind of, I call them, for a better choice of words, these cognitive interweaves, right? Whenever you're in the moment of this pose and you're like, man, I really wish they would move the hell on, right? You're struggling with that internal voice and dialogue, right? It's okay to struggle right now. Sometimes it's meant to struggle right now, right? Kind of throw that self-assessment out there and kind of let them know, like, it's okay to struggle, or it's okay to, hey, you really feel that fire in the back of your calf, right? Or you feel that, it's those things that help them start to integrate these asanas into their life. They're like, oh man, you're right. That's why I'm so tired, is my legs are so tired and hurting because they're not stretched out enough, right? So it's things like that that you're going to be integrating into your practices that, in my opinion, make yoga what yoga is today. And then definitely, we're going to talk more about this. I feel like this last one kind of starts to dive into more advanced skills. I may have mentioned this before, but I'm also pretty well versed in Ayurveda medicine as well, trying to incorporate different types of natural spices and things like that into people's lives that help them fuel one of these three things. So this is all Ayurveda type medicine pieces down here, right? We'll jump more into it. I think we even talk a little bit later this afternoon about it. But the goal here is really just to kind of start getting awareness of these types of things, right? Veda is space and air, Peta is fire and water, and then Kappa is water and earth. These have a whole meaning behind them. And then also on top of this, like if you're imbalanced in this, then this is really more lethargic, right? And things like that, sitting around being lazy. People that may have different type of body styles and things like that. So to really get them going, they need a whole lot more water, and then they need a whole lot more of nature and earth and grounding and things like that. They're going to need to be grounded a whole lot more. Whereas if you're kind of in the imbalance here, right, fire doesn't necessarily mean like set people on fire, but what it means is kind of like what I was alluding to, is if you feel that burn in your calves, right? If you feel that fire in your body, if you're feeling that in your pit, right? In your chakras, right? If you're feeling this burn, right, you're kind of probably maybe in a good place, but you may also feel overwhelmed because you're burning in multiple different meditation points. So really the focus for this would be to try to get people to focus into one meditative point and then to be able to overcome that. And then vata, space and air. Here you'll see a lot of imbalance, mainly in their mind, right? You'll see a lot more here in the mind of space, right? That's really what that means. And then air being prana, right? Being able to breathe, getting that energy in. So whenever you see that imbalance, right, you'll just really focus on breath work and things like that. But again, we'll get more into those. It's really just kind of a rundown of those. Other deepening pieces, right, is offer energetically balanced sequences. And again, I think this will come over time, but this is incorporating the sheaths, incorporating the chakras, right? Energy, anytime you probably hear energy, you're going to think two things, chakras and pranayama, right? One of those two things is what you'll be implementing. Shavasana, again, this is 5 or more minutes. This is me, right? I would never go to a yoga class that only offered me 5 minutes of shavasana, right? Like I need my integration time, right? I need my mind cooling down. I need my body cooling down. I'm going to need a whole lot more time than that. But think about that, right? What is your class? And only start to incorporate things that you practice, right? Because if you don't practice it and you try to implement it, and then you're not genuine about implementing it, your class is going to know, right? And anytime I'm implementing something new in my classes, I let all of them know that I may fumble on my words, I may fumble on how I'm going to set you up in this, but just know our peak pose today is the first time I've implemented this with this large of a class. And I kind of let them know that, right? And give them that heads up. Or even if it's something new that I've only done a few times, right? Like I've done this a few times. The first time was a complete cluster. The second time, I had about half the class doing it. So now this is going to be my third time doing it, right? Just kind of be genuine with people. I think that always goes a whole lot more. Create space for meditation. Now, what I'll say about creating space for meditation, I think we've kind of already alluded to it, is, that's the reason why I set up my practices the way that I set them up is we're sitting, you're going to come up with that intention for this practice. You're going to meditate a little bit on what your purpose is in life, right? And you're going to know what your inner resource is in case something bad happens during this practice, you got all that stuff laid out. So I think that's very important to understand and kind of implement. But then those moments in between every single asana or posture is a time for meditation. That is very important to realize as well. And of course, moving it off the map or off the mat. I don't want to, moving it off the mat. We have to translate on the mat, off the mat mindset, right? On the mat is easy for you to realize everything that you're doing. Off the mat is not, right? But the goal is to have this intuitively integrated so that whenever they're off the mat, it just comes naturally to them, right? It comes naturally to us. And that's what we're working towards. All right. So you must understand the whole life, not just one little part of it. That is why you must read. That is why you must look at the skies. That is why you must sing and dance and write poems and suffer and understand. For all that is life. And I think that is important for us to put into our sequencing and thinking about how we integrate things. We have to think about the wholeness of everything that we do, because if we don't, we will be more focused on the car that has 16 cup holders instead of the yoga mat, right? We're going to get distracted because of all the different things that says that things are healthy, right? Go to McDonald's and get your yogurt parfait that's covered in sugar and all the other things, but it's like, oh wait, that's so much better than the egg McMuffin, right? And is it though, right? Whenever you're buying it from McDonald's, right? And it's being able to not get distracted by whatever's going on in the world and focused on the wholeness of what's intrinsically valuable to you. And I think that's one of the most important reasons for starting every yoga practice with an intention of what you're going to be doing. Because that allows you to not get distracted with the 16 cup holders. And whenever you're practicing yoga, the equivalent to the 16 cup holders is that if you never mention anything about your calf burning whenever you're doing some type of stretch, then they're going to be focused on the calf burning and not that they're, needing to work more on their flexibility, right? Or their flexibility could equal them getting in the floor to play with their grandkids. Or if they're a kid, that it might equal them being able to play basketball in high school like they were wanting to, right? There's so many different things. You don't want them getting distracted by the 16 cup holders. And I think that's the reason why I added this one in here. Um, let me, okay. We got about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to go ahead and go through these because these are going to be the big things. And then in the afternoon, we'll kick off with going over the examples of the sequencing. So here we're going to talk about the sequencing a bit and what goes into it. And then afternoon, we'll really jump into the sequencing. So I think I mentioned before, these are the core elements that should go into every single um, well, it shouldn't go in every single one because, core strengthening you may not do, arm support you may not do, but these are the families that you're thinking of whenever you're putting together your sequencing. We have all kinds of standing poses, we have core awakening poses, arm balancing and support, back bends and forward bends, twist, hip openers, and inversions. I would say, easy, a little bit more hard, extremely hard, relatively easy depending on the ones they're on, easy, relatively easy again. Again, there are some harder ones. Relatively easy, but starting to get hard, right, is some hip openers. But inversions are extremely hard. And not all of them, but if you're really thinking of inversions in the sense of headstands, shoulder stands, and those types of things, they get really hard and complicated. And I would start to think about if you're going to practice inversions. But what I would think about is what poses can you practice that are inversions that you can implement into it, right? If you can't do a headstand, don't do a headstand, right? If you can't do shoulder stands, don't do shoulder stands. Things like that, and start to think about, well, okay, well, what I can do is do legs up the wall. What I can do is um, forward bends, but kind of, focused on the head being a little bit further down, things like that, right? Start to think about the inversions that you can implement that helps with drainage, because that's ultimately the big piece is here is drainage. Core awakening is your core strength, right? Sometimes people get confused because you're doing a headstand. It takes a lot of core strength that you're focused on core with inversions. No, the core strength and the core awakening is what can lead to you doing good inversions, but they do not do the same thing. So just want to kind of talk about those in those ways. Um, but these are important to kind of think these are kind of some of the ways that you're going to be doing that. Here I kind of like this, right? Mark Twain, everything that we do, I incorporate this quote just about, right? Is because the existing phrase book are inadequate, right? They are well enough as far as they go, but when you fall down and skin your leg, they don't tell you what to say, right? And I think that's very, very important. Whenever you're practicing yoga, that person doesn't know what to say whenever their calves are burning, right? They don't know what to say whenever they're getting lost by the 16 cup holders. That's kind of your job to create that space for them, right? To create that awareness, to create that interweave, that cognitive interweave, or whatever we want to call it, to where you say something that helps them realize it, right? To say, okay, well, that wasn't in the playbook. That wasn't something that was in the yoga poses or something like that. You added that flavor because this is all a unique experience, and every class is going to be unique. Every person is unique, and you are unique, right? So the playbook doesn't exist. So let's go out there and have fun and implement these things, right? And have a little, we're going to mess it up a little bit. Sequencing asana instructions, right? Teaching what you know. I think I've kind of already said that. If you can't do a back bend or a headstand, don't do a freaking headstand, right? If it's not something you know how to do not teach it. If it's not a part of your practice, do not teach it, right? If you can't do it, don't teach it. Demonstrating asanas, right? In the flow. So there's two ways to do this. I tend to do it in front of the class while I'm kind of doing it. I'll say, all right, everybody, we're going to be lifting our arm up. You're going to be taking your head down to your armpit and really smell it, right? And doing the things like this, right? And you're going to be talking about that. I demonstrate it as I do it. I'll say, watch me the first time, and then the next time we'll walk through it again as a class, right? That's how I do it. Some people do it to kind of as they go, right? They don't give a demonstration of it, they demonstrate it as other people are moving into it. I don't think there's anything bad about it. For me, what I've noticed is whenever I do it that way, is people are already moving into the pose and then they're not watching me for the next step. You know what I mean? So that's the reason why I like to demonstrate it, then have everybody do it. I won't say that happens all the time. Sometimes, especially as you're kind of flowing, but definitely I would say that peak pose, I would demonstrate the peak pose first and then do the peak pose. Have them do the peak pose, right? And then I would probably talk through the alternates of that as they're in the pose and getting into the pose. So I would demonstrate it, and then whenever they're going through it, I would say something along the lines, especially if it's a warrior pose, I would say, and if you feel like it and it's calling you, maybe rotate your shoulder or hands upwards towards the sky, right? And then if that really feels calling to you, maybe even start rotating your arms in small circles, right? Start to feel maybe a little bit more of that burn in your shoulders. That can really help ease the tension in your shoulders, right? And again, the ease the tension is the integration, right? Because we want soft shoulders that fall away from your ears that activate your parasympathetic nervous system, right? So that's the integration. So anyway, that's how I do it. And again, we'll get more into this. Transitioning into asanas. I think I've talked a lot about transitioning, right? Transitioning, in my opinion, is one of the forefront things that we can really teach. This should really be 4. So for some reason, I couldn't get these numbers to align with the last slide. But this is really 4. Refining asanas, right? You're always going to be doing this, and you're always going to be evaluating yourself. You may get done teaching, and you're like, man, I did not say one time to move with your breath. Right? I only focused on the movements, right? Like that's all right, right? We're alive, right? We're doing this. We're going to do this with every breath. Transitioning out of asanas. Again, another great way for self-discovery and transformation. Same concept. If you're moving out of it, right? Man, you were really stuck in that peak pose for a long time. It must feel really good being on the back end of that and moving towards integration, right? It's just a way for people to kind of relate it and relate it to what they can do in life, right? Is, man, I just transitioned from this. This is so easy. I was stuck there forever. And man, how good does it feel now that I'm graduating or whatever, right? Or they accomplished what it was. Absorbing and integrating the effects of asana. This is just that mind-body practicing, right? It's really letting them see it. This is probably more in the moment than this one, right? Taking it off the mat. This one's probably more in the moment of trying to absorb and integrate those pieces. And then sequencing cues. We're going to learn a lot about sequencing cues, especially this afternoon whenever we focus on the book, because it's going to give you all those sequencing cues that we'll kind of be looking at in some of those poses. Whoa. Okay. So here, these are the main concepts. We'll go through these and then we'll end. So things that are in your control and how to transition, right? So sometimes you'll slow it down. I find, and then you all will notice whenever I teach yoga, we move very, very slow. I am not a fast-paced yoga person. For me, moving slow helps us be able to understand that moving fast sometimes can make us miss a lot of things, right? So I move slow, and that's a purposeful thing that helps them show off the mat, right? So slow is always a part of my practice. Now, let's just say you're an Ashtanga or hot yoga person, right? And you're moving fast. You're in poses probably 15 to 20 seconds, and that's about it. You're constantly just kind of flowing through all these different poses. If you truly want to make a point, or you need to slow down at particular points of meditation to say, hey, we're going to sit here in this mountain pose as you all focus on your heart chakra, right? You can slow it down to kind of get those pieces in there, focus on that breath for a few moments. But that helps you transition into the next phase, is basically what I'm saying. Is you can say, okay, let's go into mountain pose. Before we transition into tree pose, let's really focus on our heart chakra right now. Let's take a few breaths as we do that. It's a good way to kind of transition. You told them what you're going to do, but then you also told them we're going to stop here for a moment and you're going to focus on this particular thing. And then pick transitions as your class theme, right? I think we kind of talked a little bit about class themes. You can easily do this, right? If you're doing standing poses, or like I said, you can literally pick a transition and the transitions to be the theme of the class, right? Notice how transitioning impacts your life. And then as they're meditating on the mat or doing what they're doing on the mat, they're noticing that. And then focus on the transfer of weight. A lot of times we'll see in the Hatha Yoga manual later that it'll talk a lot about, especially like let's use like Warrior One pose. One alternative thing that you could do while they're in Warrior One is whenever they're doing that is alternate the weight back and forth, right? That could literally be one thing. How does that relate to being off the mat, right? Is sometimes we have to put a little bit more emphasis in one bucket than the other bucket, right? To create balance in our life. Sometimes we may need to focus more on school right now to graduate. That will make our family happy, and we might not be focused on our family as much for the next 3 weeks, right? It's the balancing act. Take time to stabilize and land. Um, Here, the stabilization part to me is the meditation part. You almost stop, you focus on that breath. The time that you stat, had them stop before they go into tree pose, they're in mountain pose, right? That is a time to stabilize, right? And that's time for those cognitive interweaves to come in and also to show them that it's okay sometimes whenever you're off balance to also land in this moment, right? So it's just other ways to be able to kind of integrate. And then exhale. Typically, you never move on an inhale. You only move on exhales. So, sometimes you'll move, it'll be something along the lines of as you inhale, maybe your belly goes out, right? You'll see different types of things like that. So I don't want to say that you never move on inhales, but mostly you're going to say, okay, now exhale, fold forward, right? Now exhale, move your arm up. Now exhale, move your arm down, right? It's usually on the exhale that most moves take place. Again, I'm not going to say that you won't ever inhale and then move, but it's usually a little bit different. It's usually on the exhale that you're moving into another transition of something. And then organic flows here, this just kind of helps, right? Group inwardly rotates postures and outwardly rotates. Group standing poses together. Oh yeah, this is what this one's about, right? Is if you have outwardly facing things, right? Example, half moon and warrior B are both outwardly rotated. So you'd want those together. Same thing with these, right? These are inwardly rotated, so you would want those. Group all standing poses together, seated poses, supine poses, right? You want all of these kind of grouped together. And the main reason why, and this is also where I see a lot of young or new, I guess, yoga teachers, is they don't properly sequence things out. So then they'll go from a like warrior two pose to some type of sitting pose and then back up to standing pose and then down to some supine pose and then back up to a standing pose. And what that creates in your class is chaos, right? I mean, think about off the mat mindset. If you're sitting there making them jump up and down, get on the mat, up, standing, down, all these different things, you're showing them that that's the way life should be as well, right? Is that, and it may be in their life that it's that chaotic, but we're trying to get that to be a little bit more still, right? We're trying to get that to be a little bit more flowing. So it's a reason why you would group all of these especially together instead of having them jump between one and one. Now, again, I won't ever say that there might not be like a supine pose that you might go into a seated pose and things like that, but make sure it flows, right? Is that it's going to be a steady flow and not just getting back down, laying all the way down, then standing up, then going back to a seat, then maybe going back up to standing. It just creates a little bit more chaos. Change one thing at a time, right? Downward dog. Downward dog splits, right? Bend the knee, flip the dog, right? So kind of keep the change flowing within that change. And I know we got 1 minute left with one slide left before we get into this, but this will be yoga sequencing informed, effective, efficient, beautiful, and integrated. So really we want to have informed things that we do. We want to be informed of the knowledge. We don't want to do anything we don't practice, right? We don't want to do anything we don't know. And if we are doing things that we don't know, we want to tell everybody we don't know how we're doing it. I may practice this, but I have no idea how to teach it. So we're going to do it together. All right. And make it effective, right? You don't want to do things that are not going to be effective, but sometimes knowing your class and your audience will make that more effective and efficient. And then make every experience beautiful, right? And this is yoga. I think that is something that makes us a little bit unique, as we can make every experience beautiful. I don't think it has to be yoga to be beautiful, but at the same time, it's the mindset that we're trying to get people in. Is everything that we do is beautiful, and then we want to integrate everything. All right, I know that was kind of a lot this morning. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? What does it mean to be inwardly and outwardly rotated? Yeah, that's good, Micah. So, inwardly rotated, what we're going to be talking about, and this will be more in your anatomy classes, right? Is inwardly rotated means that you are rotating your ball joints kind of internally, and then externally would be external, right? So if you think about that as a hip, I can't really show my hip on this screen right now, but think about it of your hip, right? It would be more like this for your hip. So inwardly rotating and external. Yeah, hip rotations. There you go. Good job. But there's a lot of things that can do that outside of hips too, right? You'll hear us talk about dorsal, are your feet as well, and in those different places. We're going to do a lot on anatomy to kind of get us caught up on that. All right, did I miss any other questions? Can we print this out? Absolutely, you can print any of these things out that you want to. That is definitely in there. All right. So this afternoon, what we're going to do is, I know time is up, so if you all need to leave, but this afternoon, whenever we get back together, we'll finish up some of these class sequences. We're going to look at them together, some of these examples, and then we're going to start pulling out the book and looking at all the different poses, and probably have some breakout rooms to where you all go, and maybe have a few of you all look at standing poses, sitting poses, and other things, and then come back and kind of teach that. I will say this afternoon, to eliminate any anxiety, you will not be teaching any classes, and you will not be teaching any poses on the mat. We are only going to be using words to teach these things. And the reason why we're going to do that first is back to that original thought, is I don't want you touching people, right? I want you to be able to talk these things into existence and talk people through them before you think that you got to go correct somebody's posture pose. So that's the reason why we'll be talking about it first. All right. If no other questions, let's get off here, and then we'll be back together at, I think it's 12:30, without looking. Let me look real quick. Yep, 12:30. All right, everybody. Thank you.